I don't think it can be overstated just how impactful Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street were on the horror genre. Even today, the effects of these two powerhouse franchises can be felt, as nowadays everybody likes to point out generic 80s slasher tropes like they're fucking Sherlock Holmes solving a mystery. Regardless of how wannabe horror snobs feel about them, Freddy and Jason have left a mark on the genre that can never be understated, and they will forever hold a place in my heart and the hearts of millions of other fans out there. Like I said in my previous video on the Friday the 13th remake, which you should totally go watch if you haven't already, it has been well over a decade since we last got a Friday film, and that statement goes for the Nightmare series as well. Before both series would see their respective remakes in the late 2000s, we would finally get the crossover between these two iconic franchises in 2003 with the widely anticipated Freddy vs. Jason. Horror fans had been on their knees begging for this film since the 80s when each franchise had initially begun, and went through more development hell than the dumpster fire that was Duke Nukem Forever.
What? Did you think I was gone forever?
But, unlike Duke Nukem, the wait for Freddy vs. Jason felt like it paid off, as it seemed to live up to expectations for general audiences at the time. Considering this movie grossed far more than any other entry in either franchise up to that point in time, I'd say this film was a major success. Now, almost 20 years since the film's release, the horror landscape has changed dramatically. As a result, the genre has seen a decline in how many slasher movies are released in favor of a more artistic side of horror, like with The Lighthouse or Hereditary. In retrospect, it makes me appreciate this movie so much more than I did when I was younger. So strap in, pop open a fresh bottle of Baja Blast, and let's take a look at the greatest showdown horror has ever seen. Longtime horror fans will tell you just how exciting it was to finally be able to see Freddy vs. Jason brought to life. Ever since the two titans of terror reigned supreme during their initial film runs in the 80s, this was a matchup that fans had been asking for ages, and I think that is thanks to Marvel and DC Comics' newly adapted crossover events, like Marvel's Secret Wars and DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths. Horror and comic books have long since had a giant overlap in fandoms thanks to EC Comics and their seemingly endless catalog of horror comics dating back to as early as the 50s with Tales from the Crypt. With the large amount of fan overlap, I genuinely think that the desire for big crossovers bled into the horror fandom, and I can't possibly think of two characters who would have made for a better matchup than these two. And funny enough, the director, Ronnie Yu, who had previously directed Bride of Chucky, grew up reading comic books and used this paneling expertise to give the movie's cinematography a comic book feel. Hell, the movie even starts with Freddy monologuing like he's a shitty 90s cartoon villain, which he pretty much fully leans into the entire movie, and even both comic book continuations where Freddy and Jason meet Ash from Evil Dead. The great part about these comics, though, are that they make great continuations to the movie, and the addition of the Evil Dead franchise adds to the campy, darkly comedic tone that it was going for. These miniseries also featured guest appearances from Legacy Friday and Nightmare characters such as Tina Shepard from Friday Part 7, Tommy Jarvis from Friday Parts 4, 5, and 6, and even the spirits of Amanda Krueger and the Dream Warriors from Nightmare 3. During recent rewatches, I've come to love the way the movie blends the schlocky slaughterfest of the Friday franchise with the dark and cerebral terror of the Elm Street franchise. It gives both killers equal screen time to do what they do best, and I've always felt like that would be one of the most difficult aspects of making a movie like this. The only real gripe I can have in this regard is that I wish the Nightmare World scenes were just a little bit more creative and different. We see a little too much of the boiler room for my liking, and I know it's an iconic location in relation to Freddy himself, but when you're operating on the dreamscape, I expect a little bit more than what we've seen plenty of times already. I think we deserve that much. Speaking of expecting more than we received, a big criticism of this movie are the goddamn characters, and I will be the first to admit that it's a valid criticism 5 times over. It's no secret that the characters in this movie stink to high heaven, from the stereotypical early 2000s nerdy guy Linderman, who talks exactly like a goddamn Reddit post.
You know what, Kia? I used to think you hated me because you thought I wasn't good enough for Lori. But that's not it. See, you tear me down to make yourself feel better because you really hate yourself, which is kind of pathetic when you actually stop and think about it, assuming, of course, you can think, with all that makeup weighing down your head.
To the bitchy, homophobic, popular girl Kia.
What kind of runs around in a Christmas sweater?
There really is no shortage of awful characters to root against in this movie.
Fucking guy.
Well, hey, Jethro! This is a rave, not a Halloween party!
Why don't you go find yourself a pig to fuck?
Yeah, invite only corn poke, and you weren't invited.
Son of a bitch.
The two main characters whose names aren't in the title, Will and Laurie, aren't bad per se, but they don't really have any defining characteristics besides being in love with one another and just trying to survive the ordeal of the plot. I don't expect Scorsese levels of character writing from a movie like this, but coming from endearing characters like Nancy Thompson and Tommy Jarvis, it makes Will and Laurie feel like wet napkins in comparison. Obviously, Robert Englund gives a stellar performance as Freddy as always, but did anyone have any doubts about that being the case? As for Jason, this time around he's played by Ken Kirzinger, who had previously been killed by Mr. Voorhees in Jason Takes Manhattan. Kirzinger does a splendid job of donning the machete and making the character his own, but like most people, I wish it would have been Kane Hodder to play Jason. Kane is the man most synonymous with the character of Jason and was one of the biggest advocates for this film even happening in the first place, and I think it was a great disservice to him and us by not giving him that role.
It was going to be a success no matter what, just because people wanted to see the two characters together. And I really wish I had been able to do it.
With a crossover like this between two characters that have decades of mythos to abide by, it's quite literally impossible to please everyone who watches it. I mean, how do you go about choosing what legacy elements to bring back? What gets retconned? Who will make a return appearance besides Freddy and Jason? There's so much to consider when you make a movie like this where both sides have huge fan bases. There's so much to work with that it leaves a lot of room for mistakes. This is quite possibly the most important aspect of the movie if you ask me, because what you may or may not include can make or break someone's entire experience with a movie like this. I personally think they did an okay job at including important elements from each franchise, like the inclusion of the Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital from Nightmare on Elm Street 3, and Jason seeing a vision of his mother Pamela in the beginning is nice as well, even though this time around she wasn't played by Betsy Palmer, but that's really where it ends for me. By no means am I suggesting that every little aspect of the film has to be a reference or homage to older films, but the writing of this movie greatly suffers from the exclusion of a legacy character. Most of the runtime is dedicated to these nothing characters trying to learn things we as the audience already know, resulting in our time with the titular slashers being eaten away by clumsy exposition. Adding a surviving character from either franchise would have helped segue into the plot way smoother, but instead we're left with, whatever this is.
I mean, what if Freddy brought Jason back? Because he was too weak to go after us on his own, so he used Jason.
Freddy died by fire, Jason by water. How can we use that?
I think the overall plot they chose was good. Freddy using Jason as his pawn to resurrect himself only to lose control of the Crystal Lake Killer is a fantastic way to combine the two. I just wish the movie had lived up to its fullest potential considering just how important these two characters are to the genre. To call this movie one of my guilty pleasures feels a little disingenuous to say since it feels like I'm directly insulting the movie, but despite its many flaws, the movie is such a love letter to both franchises that I can't help but genuinely adore it. The movie knows exactly what it's supposed to be and who it's for, and delivers for fans of both Freddy and Jason, and at the end of the day, that's really all it had to be. Is this an objectively bad movie? Probably. There's plenty of aspects to this movie that you can criticize and knock it for, but it goes a little deeper than that for me. As someone who grew up with 80s slasher films all their life, this movie feels like such a swan song to that era of the genre, and I don't think the cultural significance of this movie could possibly be undersold. This was a last hurrah for an area that had long since come and gone, but the lasting legacy of these characters are timeless and will never be forgotten. Maybe one day horror will see the return of reoccurring horror villains, and we'll get another horror crossover of this magnitude. But before such a time becomes a reality, I will continue to cherish this movie for what it is and what it represents, and I hope this video helped you see why. Sincerest thanks to everyone who has watched my videos so far and enjoyed them. This has been something I've been trying to muster up the courage to do for so many years now, and it feels so good to have finally taken the leap. I can't wait to keep improving at this and keep bringing you guys horror retrospectives and reviews, and in the meantime, you guys can follow me on the Twitch and Twitter that's shown on the screen, and until next time, stay safe in these trying times, and be good to one another.